Imagine a quiet medieval village at dawn. Mist clings to the thatch roofs, chickens cluck sleepily, and the air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. In the middle of the square stands a low stone building, blackened by centuries of use, the communal bread oven. It has been there longer than anyone can remember, longer than the church bell, longer than the Lord's castle on the hill. Long before lords learned to tax sunlight and personal happiness, rivers were the one thing peasants could still trust. Water moved whether nobles permitted it or not. It carried fish, turned mill wheels, quenched thirst, and, importantly, belonged to no one. A man could kneel at the bank at dawn, cup cold water to his lips, and for one brief moment feel like a free human being. The river asked no questions. It demanded no coins. The Lord's court then fined the bridegroom for abduction of chattel, the priest for spiritual theft, and the bride for unauthorized removal of womb from inventory. Punishments were creative. One lord in Yorkshire kept a pair of iron shackles welded to the manor gate. Newlywed couples who hadn't paid were chained there until the fee was raised, sometimes for weeks. Children passed them bread and jeered, learning early that love had a price tag. Widows suffered most. A woman who had already buried one husband, paid merchant once, was expected to pay again if she dared warmth a second time. Some gave up and lived in sin. Others sold their wedding rings to buy the right to wear another. Peasants adapted with bleak humor. Brides began wearing dresses sewn with tiny hidden pockets full of straw, in case the Lord wants his sheep early. Grooms practiced a new wedding vow whispered only to each other. I take thee, and I take thee again when the bastard raises the fee. At night, around dying fires, old women told a gentler story to the girls. One day a bride will walk to the altar in a gown made of pure moonlight. The Lord will demand his merchant, and she will open her hand. Nothing but light will spill out, blinding him forever. And every woman after her will marry for free under open sky, with no coin asked and no chain forged. The girls listened, eyes wide, clutching the single silver penny they were saving for the day the story came true. The lords counted their sheep and slept well. They never noticed the moonlight gathering. Bridges. In the beginning, they were miracles. Some monk or village carpenter had lashed a few logs across a stream so old women and loaded donkeys didn't drown. Everyone called it charity, said a prayer for the builder's soul, and crossed for free for 200 years. The planks rotted, the ropes frayed, the whole thing sagged like a drunk smile, but it worked and no one tried to own it. Then the lords looked at the wobbling miracle and saw not salvation, but a cash register. The year was 1368. The place, the River Ouse in Yorkshire. Sir Geoffrey Luttrell, a man who could smell profit at 40 paces, rode up to the ancient timber bridge at Huntingdon, noted the long line of merchants, pilgrims, and peasants queuing to cross, and underwent a religious experience. Within a month, the bridge had a new owner, a new gatehouse, and a new sign in Latin no one could read except the priest, who was paid to translate it as pay or swim. The toll schedule was nailed beside the gate in cheerful red paint. Man on foot, 1 farthing. Man with pack, 1 penny horse or mule, 2 pence cart with 2 wheels, 4 pence cart with 4 wheels. We will find something to charge you for. Do not test us. Cow, 1 penny, plus 1 2-penny if it looks smug. Funeral, half price, out of Christian mercy and because corpses rarely argue. The bridge itself had not been repaired since the conquest. Half the planks were missing, the rest were slick with moss, and the central beam groaned like a dying ox. When a wool merchant's cart broke through and drowned both horse and driver, the toll collector fined the widow for littering the river with taxable goods. Peasants tried the old ways, fording upstream where the water was only waist deep. Geoffrey anticipated this. He stationed archers on both banks with orders to treat anyone in the water as attempting to defraud the bridge of its rightful moisture. A man near St. Ives was shot in the leg for waiting. The arrow was then billed to his family as medical equipment rental. Other lords rushed to copy the model. Bridges that had never known a toll suddenly sprouted booths. One enterprising baron in Devon built a toll gate on a bridge that had washed away in 1349. Travelers still paid because the collector insisted the toll was for the idea of the bridge, which remains sound. The absurdity peaked in the Low Countries, where a count installed tolls on a ferry, then on the riverbank waiting area, then on the queue itself, standing in line fee. When people sat down to avoid standing, he added a sitting on my land fee. It simply flowed, indifferent to the castles, frowning down from the hills. Then one afternoon in the summer of 1187, a young baron named Geoffrey de Mandeville, a man whose childhood nurse had apparently dropped him repeatedly on his greed, rode along the river Lea with his retinue. He stopped his horse midstream, stared at the flowing water as though it had personally insulted his mother, and announced to his startled knights, "This river offends me by being free." By 1400, crossing any water wider than a puddle required a purse, a prayer, and a strong bladder. At night, boatmen ran silent ferries for double the official toll and half the danger of arrows. Lovers met on opposite banks and shouted vows across the current because paying merche and bridge toll in the same week was impossible. Children learned to swim before they could walk properly, just in case. And in every riverside tavern, the same quiet toast was raised with whatever remained after taxes. May every bridge the Lords build have a troll underneath, and may the troll be us. The water kept moving, the coins kept moving faster, and the bridges, rotting, overpriced, and creaking like the conscience of their owners, stood as perfect monuments to the age, barely holding together, charging the world to cross, and ready to collapse the moment the poor stopped paying. Death. They finally came for death itself. By the 1380s, the lords had run out of living things to tax. Bread, water, fire, grass, beer, marriage, bridges, everything that moved, grew, burned, or loved had a coin clipped from it. Only one certainty remained untouched: the moment when a peasant stopped breathing and became at last unprofitable. That silence offended them. It began quietly in the Diocese of Hereford in 1381. The bishop, John Gilbert, a man whose soul had apparently been repossessed years earlier, noticed that when a serf died without a will, the Lord already took the best beast as Harriet. But what if the dead man had no beast? What if he died poor, stubborn, and inconveniently unmilked? Gilbert issued the mortuary regulation. Henceforth, every corpse owed a final payment. The mortuary fee, commonly the second best garment the dead person had ever owned, usually their only Sunday smock or tunic. If the family tried to bury their dead in it anyway, the corpse was exhumed, stripped, and reburied naked, while the priest pocketed the cloth and the Lord pocketed the priest. The announcement was read after Sunday Mass, right between the collect and the kiss of peace. One old man in much markle laughed so hard he choked on his own tongue and died on the spot, thus becoming the first person in the parish to pay the new tax before it was even a week old. Gravediggers became the most hated men in England. They arrived with tape measures and greedy eyes, arguing over whether a shroud counted as second best or best. Widows were forced to dress husbands in rags so the good shirt could be handed over still warm. Children learned to hide their father's one pair of shoes under the straw before the corpse was cold. Some families tried cheating death the only way left. They carried bodies out at midnight and buried them in unmarked ground near crossroads or under hedgerows. The bishop countered by offering a bounty for every clandestine cadaver reported. Neighbors turned in neighbors. Sons informed on mothers. The dead had never been so valuable. In Essex, a priest grew rich by charging extra for soul weighing, a set of scales placed dramatically on the coffin lid. The heavier the sins, the higher the fee to pray them off. In Cornwall, a lord demanded the wedding ring back from a woman who had paid merch 40 years earlier, claiming death had canceled the original lease. The Black Death, when it came in 1348-49, was greeted by some as a twisted mercy. So many died so fast that the clerks drowned in paperwork and half the mortuaries went uncollected. But the lords adapted. They simply raised the fee on the survivors for inheritance of breathable air. By 1380, the peasant death song had only one verse left, whispered over every fresh grave, while the grave digger waited with his hand out. They've taxed our bread and taxed our bed, taxed the living and the dead. But when we rise with fork and flame, the dead will owe no tax again. On the 13th of June, 1381, a tiler named Wat Tyler stood up in a field in Kent and discovered that the dead, when remembered correctly, can still walk. Within a week, proclamations were nailed to oak trees from Hertfordshire to Essex. The river now belonged to Lord Geoffrey by ancient right of, "Because I have more swords than you." Anyone wishing to cross it, fish, water livestock, wash clothes, or, in one particularly creative clause, allow their shadow to fall upon the current, owed a toll. Behind him marched men and women who had nothing left to lose except the mortuary shroud they hadn't yet been forced to pay for. The lords laughed until they heard the sound of many feet crossing bridges that suddenly had no toll booths, entering forests that no longer had foresters, walking roads that belonged to everyone again. Death, it turned out, had been saving its receipt, the year of the knife and the pitchfork. They came in the summer of 1381 like a storm-thatched fire nobody bothered to put out. First, it was a village in Essex, where the reeve tried to collect the new poll tax from a girl who had already paid once with her body when the tax collector came drunk to her cottage. Her father split the reeve's skull with an axe he had never been allowed to own. The neighbors, instead of running to fetch the bailiff, quietly closed their doors and began sharpening whatever they had. By the time the sun was high, 30 men were walking the road to Brentwood, carrying scythes, billhooks, and one ancient sword someone's grandfather had hidden since Agincourt. They burned the tax rolls in the marketplace. Nobody stopped them. The king's commissioners fled so fast one left his boots behind. The fire jumped. In Kent, Wat Tyler and a barefoot priest named John Ball rode into Canterbury at the head of 10,000 people who had decided that the world had been upside down long enough. They opened the jail, kissed the prisoners, then walked to the cathedral and made the archbishop hand over the charters that said they were cattle. They burned those too. In London, the gates were opened from the inside by apprentices who had paid bridge tolls one too many times. The rebels poured in like floodwater. They did not loot gold. They beheaded lawyers, tax collectors, and Flemish merchants who had bought monopolies on wool. They found the Archbishop of Canterbury hiding under a bed in the Tower and carried him to Tower Hill. His head came off with one clean stroke. The crowd cheered the executioner for not charging a fee. For 1 week, the city belonged to people who had never owned anything. They sat at the Lord's tables and ate with their hands. They wore the judges' robes like carnival costumes. They opened the prisons and the granaries and the wine cellars. Children ran through the streets wearing mitres backwards and ringing handbells that had once called them to unpaid labor. Richard II, 14 years old and pale as milk, rode out to meet them at Mile End. He promised everything: freedom, abolition of serfdom, an end to the taxes. They believed him because they wanted to believe someone, anyone born in a palace, could still speak like a human. He signed the charters with a trembling hand. That night, while the rebels slept in the fields, the lords gathered their knights. At Smithfield the next day, they murdered Wat Tyler in front of everyone. The boy king raised his hand and shouted, "I am your captain now." And the crowd, leaderless, stunned, went home clutching worthless scraps of parchment. Then the hangings began. They hanged men from every oak that had once been too royal to cut for firewood. They hanged boys who had rung those bells. They hanged women who had carried water to the rebels. They hanged the blind and the lame, who had done nothing but cheer from doorways. In St. Albans, they hanged a man on the gallows he himself had built for someone else the year before. By Christmas, the charters were canceled, the taxes doubled, and the lords congratulated one another on how close they had come to losing everything. But something had cracked that could not be mended with rope or parchment. In every village, a few survived, one-eyed, limbless, silent. They went home and taught their children a new lullaby with no words, just the soft wetting sound of a scythe on stone. They no longer cursed the lords aloud. They simply waited, the way forests wait, the way rivers wait, the way the poor have always waited when every other door is locked. The lords rebuilt the toll gates, repossessed the bridges, rehung the signs that said mine. They never noticed that the signs burn faster than wood, and that memory burns longer than either. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Peasants arrived at the banks the next morning to find a cheerful innovation: a wooden toll bridge spanning a stretch of river so shallow that a drunk chicken could wade across without wetting its tail feathers. A booth had been erected. A guard with the expression of a man who had found his life's calling sat inside, collecting pennies from bewildered villagers who had crossed this same spot barefoot since childhood. The enclosures came, the factories, the machines, the clean, bright offices where new men in new suits discovered that an oven, a river, a road, a blade of grass, a drop of rain, a human body, a heartbeat can still be rented if you write the right law. But on certain summer nights, when the moon is thin and the air smells of cut hay, old people in certain villages still leave a crust of bread and a cup of small beer on the doorstep. No one remembers why anymore. They only know the cup is always empty by morning, and somewhere far away, someone is still walking the old roads without paying, carrying fire that owes no lord its warmth. The last thing they tried to tax was time. It happened quietly, in the way the worst things always do. In the year 1769, in a valley in Derbyshire, where the new mills were already eating the days, a manufacturer named Richard Arkwright, polite smile, iron heart, installed a clock on the factory gate. Workers who arrived 1 minute late had a quarter-hour's wage docked. 1 minute early was unpaid. The clock did not tick. It bit. The bell rang at 5 in the morning. It rang again at 8 at night. Between those two sounds belonged to the owner. Meals were taken at the bench. Toilet breaks were measured by a smaller, hungrier clock. Children who fell asleep over the spinning frames were woken with a bucket of cold water and fined for wasting daylight the owner had paid for. Time, which had once been measured by sun and hunger and the slow turning of seasons, now belonged to whoever owned the bell. A girl named Mary Walls, 8 years old and already missing two fingers, asked the overseer why the big hand moved faster on the way out than on the way in. The overseer laughed and docked her another farthing for philosophical inquiry during working hours. The workers called it the Devil's Watch. They tried to fight it the way their ancestors had fought ovens, rivers, bridges, and mortuary fees. They broke the clock. One night in 1779, 100 women in wooden clogs marched through the gates of Cromford Mill with hammers hidden under shawls. They smashed every clock they could find, then set fire to the timesheets. Arkwright replaced the clocks with bigger ones, iron-cased, padlocked, mounted 10 feet high. He hired guards with dogs and called it progress. But the women had learned something their great-grandmothers in 1381 would have recognized. You cannot hang a minute from a tree. You cannot brand an hour. You cannot bury a second in a pauper's grave and expect it to stay there. Time leaks. It leaks through keyholes, through cracks in the floorboards, through the slow drip of memory. It leaks into songs sung too soft for the overseer to hear, into the way a man's hand lingers on his child's hair at the end of a 14-hour day, into the stubborn refusal to hurry when no one is watching. The clocks kept getting bigger. The cages kept getting tighter. The songs kept getting quieter. And still, every so often, on nights when the moon is the exact color of a scythe blade, someone somewhere smashes a clock. They never catch them all. Because time, in the end, belongs to the people who have nothing left to lose but the hours they were never allowed to live. And one day, not today, not tomorrow, but one day, the last bell will ring unanswered. The last gate will stand open. The last toll booth will burn like dry thatch. And a woman with flour on her hands, or calluses from a mill frame, or grease from a keyboard, will walk out into the morning carrying a crust of bread and a cup of something warm that no one taxed, measured, or timed. She will not look back. Behind her, the clocks will finally stop, not because they are broken, but because no one is listening anymore. One old woman, famous for her sharp tongue and sharper elbows, tried to waiting anyway. She made it 3 steps before 2 men-at-arms waded in, seized her by the arms, and marched her back to the booth. "Unauthorized fortage," the guard intoned, writing the charge in a ledger with ceremonial seriousness. "That'll be double toll plus a wetting fee." "But I'm already wet," she protested. "Exactly. Wetting fee applies." Word spread quickly. Other lords, never ones to let a profitable absurdity go unimitated, hurried to their own rivers. Chains were stretched across currents. Ropes with bells were strung to catch nighttime crossers. In one memorable case in Normandy, a duke built a toll bridge across a river that froze solid every winter, then charged skaters in January for unauthorized ice passage. Soon the taxes multiplied like frogs after rain. Crossing fee, one way. Crossing fee, return journey, because apparently rivers only flowed in one direction on the way back. Drinking fee per gulp, estimated by guard. Livestock hydration tax. Cows were assumed to drink more than sheep naturally. Fishing license, daily, weekly, or lifetime. Lifetime strongly discouraged. Net drying fee, because wet nets on the bank were occupying riparian space. Scenic enjoyment fee, for looking at the river too long. One enterprising lord in the Rhineland introduced the contemplation tax. Any peasant caught staring thoughtfully at the water owed a fine on the grounds that he was clearly thinking about evading tolls. Children learned new games. Play toll bridge involved sticking a stick in the mud and demanding a leaf from every passing friend. Mothers hushed babies with the lullaby threat. Hush now, or the riverman will come and tax your dreams. However, at night, desperate families tried to sneak water in buckets under cover of darkness. Guards countered by patrolling with lanterns and trained dogs that barked at the sound of sloshing. Captured water thieves were fined for nocturnal hydration without permit. In extreme cases, their buckets were confiscated for the Lord's stables. And still the river flowed, exactly as it had for 10,000 years, carrying fish, carrying silt, carrying away the quiet tears of people who had once believed water, at least, would always be free. The Lord slept soundly in their stone halls, dreaming of new things to own. The peasants learned a bitter truth. Once a man decides to charge for what God himself provides, even the rain begins to feel like it's on a meter. Every morning, women arrive with their damp balls of rye dough wrapped in cloth, gossiping softly while the fire is stoked. No one owns the oven. No one pays to use it. It simply belongs to everyone. The last truly free thing in a world where freedom is measured in crumbs. This was the one wholesome corner of feudal life, a place where peasants, serfs, and even the occasional passing pilgrim could turn grain into bread without a coin changing hands. If the oven taught lords they could sell fire, and the river taught them they could sell water, the hand mill taught them the most intoxicating lesson of all. They could sell hunger itself. Every peasant family owned one. Two flat stones, a wooden handle, and arms strong from years of turning. It was slow, back-breaking work, an hour of grinding for enough flour for one day's bread. But it was theirs. No queue, no steward, no handing over one loaf in 12. Just you, the grain, and the quiet creak, creak, creak that meant your children would eat tonight. Lords hated that sound. In the year 1199, William de Bruce, a baron with the moral flexibility of a wet rope, sat in his solar counting silver and listening. Far below, across his estates in Sussex, he could hear that rhythmic scraping drifting on the wind like a personal insult. Hundreds of tiny stones turning, hundreds of families feeding themselves without giving him a single grain. He summoned his steward. Make it stop. Within days, heralds rode from village to village with a proclamation nailed to every church door. By order of the Lord's peace, all handmills, querns, and grinding stones are hereby declared illegal. All grain must now be brought to the Lord's mill, where it shall be ground for the fair and customary rate of 1 sack and 16, plus incidental fees. The incidental fees turned out to be numerous and imaginative. Peasants arrived at dawn to find their cottage doors kicked in. Men-at-arms overturned tables, smashed clay pots, and carried off the family quern like thieves stealing a saint's relic. In one recorded case, a widow begged to keep her stones for the sake of my starving babes. The soldiers broke them anyway, then fined her sixpence for obstructing the king's justice with tears. Families tried hiding the stones, burying them under floors, walling them into chimneys, disguising them as doorstops. It didn't matter. The mill inspectors, a new and universally despised profession, arrived with iron bars and dogs. They tapped walls, sniffed for rye dust, and offered rewards to neighbors willing to snitch. One inspector in Yorkshire bragged he could smell an unlicensed quern at 50 paces. When the stones were found, the punishment was theatrical. The millstones were dragged into the village square and publicly shattered with sledgehammers while the owner was forced to watch. Children were made to attend so they learned respect for lawful commerce. Then came the forced march to the Lord's mill. Picture it, a woman with a baby on her hip and a sack of grain on her back, walking 3 miles each way because the mill was deliberately built far from the villages. She joins a queue of silent, furious neighbors stretching into the mist. When her turn finally comes, the miller, usually the Lord's lazy cousin, weighs the grain, skims off the best portion for shrinkage, grinds what's left, skims again for dust, then presents a bill. Base milling fee, 1/16, sack handling fee, waiting in line fee, flour spillage tax, windage for the breeze that might have blown flour away. A new one, the gratitude levy for the privilege of using such a fine modern mill. If the mill broke, which it did constantly, frozen in winter, flooded in spring, on fire every time someone sneezed near a candle, the fee remained the same. One chronicler recorded a mill in Normandy that hadn't turned in 6 months, yet still collected full rates because the right to grind is eternal, even when the wheel is not. Some families tried grinding secretly at night with hidden stones. When caught, and many were, the punishment escalated to branding or having an ear nailed to the mill door for a day. The message was clear. Independence itself was now a crime. Across Europe, the sound of the handmill died out, replaced by the clink of coins into the Lord's coffers and the slow, steady grind of 1,000 resentments being sharpened into something dangerous. The Lords congratulated themselves. The heat was shared, the soot was shared, the faint scent of rising dough was shared. For a brief moment each day, hunger felt negotiable. And then, one spring morning in the year 1142, the Lord rode down from his manor with 20 armed men. He was not coming to collect taxes or press men into war. He was coming for the oven. The villagers gathered in uneasy silence as he dismounted. They had taken the most basic act of survival, turning grain into flour, and turned it into a machine that ran on human desperation. They slept better at night, dreaming of the next free thing they could outlaw. The peasants learned to chew their anger along with their coarse, overtaxed bread. And in the dark, a few old women whispered to their grandmothers' spells over the broken pieces of cornstone buried beneath the hearth. Curses that the Lord's teeth would rot, his horses go lame, and his soul be forced to grind rye in hell for eternity, one grain at a time, with no fee forgiven. Firewood was the medieval peasant's last love letter from God. When winter clamped down and the wind howled like a hungry wolf at the door, a bundle of sticks meant the difference between life and a slow, blue-lipped death. Fallen branches, wind-snapped twigs, dead hedge trimmings, all of it lay scattered across the forest floor as if the Almighty himself had scattered kindling for the poor. No one had ever needed permission to pick up what the storm knocked down. You bowed your head, muttered thanks, filled your apron or sling, and carried warmth home on your back, until the lords noticed. In the frost-bitten January of 1278, Hugh de Neville, royal forester and professional miser, rode through Epping Forest and saw something that turned his blood to ice colder than the weather. A peasant woman bending over to pick up a single crooked branch. Hugh nearly fell off his horse. That branch, though presently on the ground, had until recently been attached to a tree. That tree grew on royal soil. Therefore, by the unbreakable logic of feudal law, the branch, the tree, the soil, the air above the soil, and the very concept of combustion all belonged to the king, and, by convenient delegation, to Hugh. That night he drafted the Ordinance of the Ver. By Shrove Tuesday, every forest within 50 miles had new signs hammered to oaks. All fallen wood is royal property. Gathering without license, just theft of heat, a high treason against warmth itself. The license cost threepence a week, more than many families saw in a month. It came on a scrap of parchment stamped with a green wax acorn and had to be worn visibly so the trees themselves may recognize lawful bearers. Guards called wood reeves were hired in droves. They patrolled the forest with dogs, whistles, and the smug satisfaction of men paid to ruin childhood memories. They hid behind bushes waiting for the telltale snap of a twig being lifted. When they pounced, the scene was always the same. Drop the stick, villain. But it's on the ground. Exactly. Royal ground. Royal stick. Hands where I can see them. Fines were tiered with demonic precision. One fallen branch, sure 4 pence, one armful, sure number 12 pence, one sling load, nart, public flogging, anything that could plausibly heat a cottage for a night, none a confiscation of cloak, shoes, and the wood itself, for the Lord's hearth, naturally. Desperate peasants adapted. They went out after dark, crawling on bellies like soldiers, stuffing sleeves and hoods with silent twigs. Children were sent because small bodies made less noise, and if caught, might only lose only an ear instead of a hand. Entire villages developed a whistle code, one short for "Reeve approaching," two long for "Run, mother, they've got the dogs." Some lords grew creative. In the Black Forest, a count introduced the freshness surcharge. Any branch showing green at the break was deemed live wood and punished by hanging, the thief, not the branch. In Devon, peasants were fined for excessive sighing while gathering, on the grounds that melancholy reduced productivity and was therefore taxable. The irony burned hotter than any hearth. Forests that had once fed cottage fires now warmed only baronial halls. He walked around the ancient stone structure as though seeing it for the first time, running a gloved hand over the soot, frowning like a man who has just discovered someone has been drinking his wine cellar without permission. Finally, he turned to the crowd and spoke the sentence that would echo across Europe for the next 400 years. This oven now belongs to me. From this day forward, anyone who wishes to bake bread will pay the banality fee. 1 loaf in 12 is mine by right. Peasants shivered in darkness while lords lounged before roaring blazes, made of the very sticks their tenants had been whipped for touching. Old women began telling a new bedtime story, and about the day St. Nicholas would descend not with gifts, but with an axe, and every lord who ever stole warmth from the poor would be forced to spend eternity gathering firewood in hell, naked in snow, while devils charged him a penny per splinter and laughed. The forest grew quieter after that winter, not because the wind stopped blowing, but because no one dared pick up what it left behind. Walking, the one human activity that had remained gloriously, stubbornly free since Adam was kicked out of Eden. Peasants walked everywhere, to the fields at dawn, to church on Sunday, to market with a chicken under each arm, to their own slow funerals. Their legs were their horses, their ships, their only guaranteed property. No one, not king, not pope, not the devil himself, had ever figured out how to put a gate across a footpath and demand payment for the crime of forward motion. Until 1283, when Robert de Beaumont, Lord of Beaumont-le-Roger in Normandy, looked at the ancient dirt track that ran past his castle and had what he later described in his private diary as a vision of pure genius. He ordered a sturdy oak gate erected across the road, complete with iron spikes, a little hut, and a sign painted in cheerful red letters: toll for the privilege of using the Lord's highway foot passengers. 1 denier with basket or bundle, 2 deniers with pig, 4 deniers with opinions. Double. The first traveler to encounter it was Jeanne la Fileuse, a spinner on her way to market with a sack of wool on her back. She stared at the gate for a full minute, then at the guard picking his teeth with a dagger, then back at the gate. "But I've walked this road since I was in swaddling clothes," she said. "Congratulations," the guard replied. "Today you pay for the upgrade." Jean tried walking around through the ditch. A second guard materialized as if grown from the mud itself and fined her for unauthorized use of verge. Word raced up and down the track like wildfire. By evening, a queue of baffled peasants stretched from the gate to the horizon. Monks, peddlers, children sent with messages, an old man carrying his sick wife on a hurdle, all forced to empty their pockets for the right to put one foot in front of the other on the same dirt their grandfathers had trodden without let or hindrance. Other lords copied the idea with the frantic enthusiasm of men who had just discovered printing money with their bare hands. Gates sprouted overnight on roads that had never known pavement, let alone maintenance. Some were built across sheep trails, barely wide enough for 2 goats to pass without apologizing. One enterprising baron in Anjou installed a toll booth on a bridge that had collapsed 20 years earlier. Travelers still had to pay for the memory of the bridge. The fees multiplied faster than rabbits in spring. Daylight passage fee, night passage fee, higher for the danger of darkness the Lord had not caused. Hurried passage fee for those walking too fast and therefore wearing out the road. Funeral procession fee with a pious discount because even greed has limits. Barefoot discount, removed when lords noticed peasants immediately took off their shoes. Peasants fought back the only way they knew how, by inventing the medieval equivalent of off-road driving. They abandoned the roads entirely and pioneered a network of secret paths through forests, marshes, and thorn thickets. Grandmothers developed calves like oxen from detouring miles out of their way. Children grew up believing that straight lines were a myth told by liars. Lords responded by declaring the grass beside the road verge royal and posting more guards. One particularly thorough count in Flanders hired unemployed minstrels to stroll the ditches, singing loudly so that anyone trying to sneak past would be betrayed by the sudden silence of birds. Entire villages began scheduling their lives around toll avoidance. Market days shifted to whichever saint's feast fell on a moonless night. Weddings were held at 3 a.m. so the bride's family could reach the church without bankruptcy. Midwives charged extra for nocturnal obstetrics toll surcharge. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath. One woman clutched her dough so tightly that raw rye oozed between her fingers. A child began to cry. Somewhere a dog barked once and thought better of it. The priest tried to protest. My lord, the oven was built by the grandfathers of our grandfathers. It is custom. Custom, the Lord interrupted, smiling the thin, satisfied smile of a man who has just invented gravity. Is whatever I say it is. And still people walked, because stopping was not an option. At night, when the gates were locked and the guards dozed by their braziers, peasants whispered a new proverb around dying cottage fires. They have taken the bread from our mouths, the water from our cups, the heat from our hearths, and now the road from under our feet. One day we will take the road back, and we will not stop walking until we reach their gates with their own toll bars. The lords laughed at such talk. Fishing was the final sanctuary. When the ovens, rivers, mills, forests, and even the roads had fallen under the Lord's ledger, the water still seemed untouchable. Fish swam where they pleased, nets were cheap to weave, and the riverbank belonged to anyone brave enough to sit there all night with chapped hands and a hungry heart. A single good haul of eel or perch could feed a family for days, and no steward had yet figured out how to stand in the middle of a current, swinging a spear and shouting, "Mine!" That changed in the spring of 1291 on the banks of the River Severn. Sir Roger de Mortimer, fresh from losing most of his money at tournaments and needing a quick miracle, stood on a bridge watching a tenant named Wat Catchpole pull a fat trout from the water with his bare hands. The fish flashed silver in the sun. Roger's eyes flashed silver too, but a different kind. By Michaelmas, every stream, river, pond, and suspiciously damp ditch in 3 counties belonged to Roger. By ancient piscatorial right, new signs appeared on willow trees. All fish, frogs, eels, reeds, and confused otters are the exclusive property of the Lord fishing without license, are in a theft of dinner from the Lord's own table. The license cost a full day's wages and lasted exactly until the ink dried. Guards now patrolled the banks wearing wading boots and the smug expression of men who had discovered a way to tax hope. Wat Catchpole tried reasoning. My lord, the fishes swim into my net of their own sinful free will. Roger smiled the smile of a man who had just invented original sin. Then their will is now subject to my will. Pay or the fish goes free and you go to the stocks. The fees blossomed like pondweed. Daily fishing fee, night fishing surcharge. Fish apparently taste richer after dark. By species tax, pike cost more than perch for being haughtier. Net license, bait license, license to look longingly at the water, accidental catch tax for any fish that leapt suicidally into your boat during a storm. One monk in Worcestershire was fined for possessing a barrel that smelled suspiciously optimistic. Peasants adapted with grim ingenuity. They fished at 3 a.m. under new moons, using nets dyed the color of mud. Children stood lookout on hills, signaling with mirrors made from polished cooking pots. Whole villages developed a silent language of coughs. One cough for guard approaching, two for run, they've got the big net. Some lords grew genuinely creative. In the Loire Valley, a count introduced the admiration tax. Anyone caught watching someone else fish owed half a denier for enjoying the spectacle without participation. In Kent, a baron attempted to tax fish for the crime of being born in his water. The fish, being illiterate, ignored the proclamation, but the peasants still had to pay. The worst innovation came from Flanders, the empty creel fine. If you fished all day and caught nothing, you were charged for wasting the river's time. At night, families who once ate fresh trout now chewed stale bread and told their children stories of the old days when fish were so plentiful that grandfathers had to beat them off with sticks. The children listened wide-eyed, then asked the question that broke every parent's heart. Will the Lord's tax dreams next? The parents had no answer. They only pulled the thin blankets higher and listened to the river flowing past, still free in its bed, but no longer free in theirs. They laughed all the way to the bank, a building that did not yet exist, but whose spirit already lived happily in their hearts. Rain. Of all the things medieval lords tried to own, nothing reveals their unhinged greed quite like their attempt to tax the sky. It began in the wet autumn of 1315, the year the heavens opened and refused to close again. Crops rotted in the fields, cattle drowned standing up, and every roof in Christendom leaked like a sieve. Overnight, the village square changed. A wooden barrier appeared around the oven. A steward sat on a stool with a ledger and a bowl for coins. Guards lounged nearby, sharpening knives and looking bored. The smell of fresh bread still drifted through the lanes, but now it carried a bitter aftertaste of resentment. Peasants lined up like supplicants at a shrine, handing over their dough and their coins. In the county of Hainaut, a minor noble named Jean de Dampierre stood at his castle window watching rain drum on the heads of peasants scurrying below. Water poured off thatch, filled every rut, and ran in rivulets toward the moat he had paid a fortune to dig. He watched a woman tilt her face upward, mouth open, letting the rain wash away weeks of flour dust and despair. Jean's mind, untroubled by conscience or meteorology, made a terrible leap. That is my water falling on my land. Therefore it is my water. The next Sunday after Mass, the village crier read the new edict in a voice that cracked with embarrassment. By order of the most noble and thirsty Lord Jean, all rain that falleth upon the domain of Dampierre is declared seigneurial property. Any person collecting, cupping, barreling, puddling, or otherwise enjoying said rain shall render unto the Lord 1 measure in 10, or the value thereof in silver. The priest dropped his missal. A baby stopped crying out of sheer confusion. That afternoon, inspectors, now wearing special wax cloaks embroidered with a silver raindrop, marched from cottage to cottage with measuring rods and tiny buckets. Every barrel, every trough, every suspiciously full cooking pot was noted in a ledger titled Precipitation Accounts. The tariffs were a masterpiece of damp bureaucracy. Roof runoff fee per square foot of thatch, eavesdrop fee, literally water caught under eaves, puddle tax, assessed by boot print depth, accidental facial hydration fine for anyone caught outside with mouth open, bucket possession tax, even empty buckets were intending to commit rainfall. One widow was fined for allowing tears to mingle with royal rain, thereby diluting the seigneurial share. Peasants tried everything. They knocked holes in barrels so water would drain before inspection. They placed buckets inside cottages under leaks, then claimed it was indoor condensation, not actual rain. Children were sent out in storms to kick over puddles before the inspectors arrived. Whole villages developed a sudden, devout habit of praying indoors with mouths firmly shut. The inspectors countered with nocturnal raids. Lanterns bobbed through the downpour as men in oiled cloaks measured water levels in horse troughs and listened for the telltale plink of illicit collection. One particularly zealous official fined a man for excessive snoring during rainfall, claiming the vibrations shook extra drops from the thatch into an unlicensed pot. In the spring of 1316, when the rains finally stopped and famine truly began, Jean de Dampierre sat in his dry hall counting barrels of rainwater he had seized from starving tenants. He toasted his own ingenuity with wine imported from vineyards that had somehow escaped his jurisdiction. That winter, the peasants told a new story around guttering tallow candles. The tale of the day St. Peter, tired of earthly nonsense, would open the clouds and rain fire instead of water. And every lord who ever tried to tax the sky would be forced to stand outside forever, naked, holding a thimble, begging the heavens for one merciful drop that would never, ever fall. The rain kept falling, indifferent to proclamations, but it no longer felt like mercy, the most ordinary miracle on earth. It grew everywhere, asked nothing, fed every creature that walked on four legs, and cost exactly zero thoughts until a futile brain finally noticed it was free. In the summer of 1324, Baldwin de Redver, Lord of the Isle of Wight, rode across his new domain and saw a sight that stopped his heart. Hundreds of peasant cows, goats, sheep, and even geese placidly chewing grass that had the audacity to belong to no one. The animals looked fat. The peasants looked, well, not starving. This was clearly a crisis of cosmic proportions. That night he drafted the Edict of the Green Fee. By Lammas, every blade of grass on the island, standing, trampled, half-eaten, or merely contemplated, was declared seigneurial herbage. A painted post went up at every crossroads. Common pasture is abolished. All grazing is by paid license. 1 penny per hoof per day. Thinking about grass is taxable if eyebrows are raised. The islanders thought it was a joke until the grass reeves arrived, 6 sullen men with tally sticks and the dead eyes of professional herbivores. If your loaf came out burned because the steward's nephew was drunk and let the fire die, you still paid. If your loaf came out perfect, you still paid. If you dared complain, you paid an extra fee for insolence measured by tone of voice. Some tried baking at home. Medieval cottages, however, were built of wood, mud, and optimism. A hearth fire could turn a house into a bonfire faster than you could say uncontrolled combustion. They worked in pairs, one to count hooves, one to collect coins. A family cow, shocker, 4 pence. A milking goat, 2 pence. A gander that technically had no hooves but expressed grassy intent, charges 1 penny anyway. Children under 10 were charged half rate because their future teeth would eventually chew. Peasants tried everything. They muzzled animals at dawn and drove them out only after dark. They carried goats piggyback through village lanes so no hoof touched taxable ground. One enterprising shepherd trained his flock to walk on stilts made of bean poles. The reeves simply added a hoof elevation surcharge. The worst innovation was the night grazing patrol. Lantern-bearing guards roamed the meadows listening for suspicious chewing. When they heard it, they pounced like cats on mice, counting animals by moonlight and issuing dawn citations. A man in Ventnor was fined for permitting his cow to dream of clover, proven by the animal's contented sigh. Some families sold their last cow to pay the fees for the cow they had just sold. Others moved livestock into cottages at night, sleeping beside goats that bleated them awake and left gifts on the hearth. Milk yields fell. Children grew thinner. The Lord's stables, meanwhile, grew fatter on confiscated hay. At Harvest Home that year, the traditional feast was canceled. There was no money for ale, and the grass itself had become too expensive to dance on. Instead, the villagers gathered in secret, under a harvest moon so bright it felt like accusation, and told their children anew verses to an old song. The Lord has taken fire and flood, the road, the rain, the grain, the blood. But one day soon the grass will rise and wrap green chains around his thighs. He'll chew what we have chewed and know how bitter freedom tastes below. They sang it softly, mouths barely moving, while the reeves walked the hedges with lanterns, trying to tax even the wind that bent the blades. The grass kept growing. It always does. Beer. Not wine, not mead, not the fancy imported stuff that lords guzzled while calling it civilization. Beer. Cloudy, sour, weak, and, until the 1330s, the only thing standing between a medieval peasant and death by dirty water. Every cottage brewed its own. Women, mostly women, kept the craft alive. A handful of barley, a fistful of herbs, a pot over the hearth, and 3 days of anxious watching so the batch didn't turn into vinegar or explode. It was warm, it was safe, it tasted like damp bread left in a sock, and it was free. A family could drink a gallon a day and still have enough to share with neighbors. Beer was community glue, baptism gift, funeral wake, and medicine all in one foaming bucket. Lords tolerated it for centuries because it kept the lower orders too drowsy to revolt. Then someone sobered up long enough to realize the lower orders were happy. In 1337, the town council of Ipswich, 12 merchants and one bishop who owed money to all of them, passed the Ale Regulation Act. Overnight, home brewing became unlicensed fermentation, a phrase so pompous it could only have been invented by men who had never scrubbed a mashed tun in their lives. The new rules were read from the market cross while the town ale taster stood beside the crier, wearing a ceremonial leather tankard on a chain like a mayor's medallion. Key points. All ale must be brewed in licensed premises, i.e., breweries owned by the council or their cousins. Private brewing pots over 1 gallon are declared contraband. Every barrel sold in town must bear the official stamp, applied only after inspection and payment. Inspectors may enter any house at any hour to prevent illicit bubbling. The ale tasters, now a paid, full-time profession, roam the lanes with noses held high, sniffing chimneys for the telltale yeasty sweetness. When they smelled it, they kicked indoors like avenging angels of sobriety. One widow in St. Nicholas Parish was dragged before the council for brewing sufficient unto 3 households and a sick pig. Her defense, my pig has the priest said it was medicinal, was overruled. Entire villages had vanished overnight because someone tried to bake a single rye loaf in a chimney. Lords knew this. They encouraged the attempts. Every cottage that burned was one less family competing with the lordly oven. So people paid. They paid with clipped silver, with eggs, with promises, with the quiet grinding of teeth at night. They paid while inventing curses so creative that modern stand-up comedians would blush. They paid and they remembered. The pot was smashed in the street, the ale poured into the gutter, and the pig fined for complicity. Legal brewing became a circus. You carried your grain to the town brewery, queued for hours, paid the malt fee, the water fee, the heat fee, the yeast rental, and the goodwill froth tax. The finished ale came back weaker than before because the brewers skimmed the best for resale at triple price. If you complained, you were banned for insulting the head. Villages fought back with glorious desperation. They brewed in the woods at midnight, hiding cauldrons under piles of leaves. Children stood sentry with owl calls. Entire parishes developed a secret sign language. Two fingers tapped to the lips meant fresh batch ready. Three meant taster on the prowl. Barrels were buried in churchyards under fresh graves. No inspector would dig up the dead for suspicion of hops. One famous rebellion in Bury St. Edmunds saw women form the Order of the Hidden Mash. They brewed in the abbey's own laundry vats while the monks were at prayer, then rolled the barrels out disguised as corpses for burial. The ale taster who tried to stop the funeral was pelted with hot mash and fled wearing a cauliflower of foam like a crown of shame. The council doubled the fines. The women doubled the recipes. In the end, beer survived barely. But it was never again the carefree drink of grandmothers and harvest homes. Every pint now carried a silent toast underneath the foam. To the day the barrels roll the other way, and the tasters drown in their own tax. The lords raised their silver cups and laughed. Forests. Once upon a time, before the word recreation existed, the forest was simply where poor people went to stay alive. You walked in with an empty belly and came out with mushrooms, acorns, a rabbit if God was kind, a bundle of faggots if he was merely fair. The trees did not ask your lineage. The deer did not care about your rent. For a few hours you could stand under green shadows and pretend the world was still the way it was before someone invented mine. Flonanoworm. Then kings and nobles discovered that forests were perfect for their favorite sport. Riding around in circles, shouting while servants beat the bushes, so frightened animals ran toward arrows. To make the game more exciting, they needed the woods empty of peasants who might accidentally scare the deer or, worse, eat it first. In 1342, Edward III of England formally declared vast tracts royal forest, not because they contained trees, many were open heath, but because he liked the sound of the phrase. The forest law that followed was written with the calm insanity of a man who had never gathered a single stick in his life. New crimes were invented overnight: looking at a deer without permission, owning a bow inside forest bounds, allowing your pig to have venison-adjacent thoughts. The punishment scale was breathtaking. First offense, fine the price of a cow. Second offense, blinding in one eye. Third offense, the other eye, so the forest may keep both your gazes as souvenirs. Because once a lord realized he could charge for heat that had been free since the Bronze Age, a dangerous precedent had been set. If heat could be taxed, then anything could be taxed. Water, grass, sunshine, the very act of breathing too deeply near a manor house. The communal oven was only the first domino, and Europe was about to discover that once you let a man in chainmail monetize warmth, he will never ever stop. Foresters, wardens with green tunics and black hearts, patrolled on horseback with packs of mastiffs trained to hate the smell of poverty. They could hang you on the spot for carrying a snare. They could cut off your hand for picking up a shed antler. One man in Sherwood was executed for possessing a gray feather that might once have belonged to a royal pheasant. Peasants learned to move through the trees like ghosts. Mothers taught children to walk, placing heel before toe so no twig cracked. They gathered by moonlight, filling skirts and hoods in total silence, then vanished before the horn sounded at dawn. Every family had a forest name, whispered only among themselves. because using your real name under the greenwood was considered bad luck ever after. Some lords went further. In Normandy, a duke declared that any tree tall enough to hang a man from was automatically reserved for judicial purposes, so peasants were forbidden to cut even dead branches, lest the rope be deprived of future employment. The royal hunts themselves became traveling apocalypses. 100 nobles, 500 horses, trumpets, hounds, and hawk bells would descend on a wood, trample crops, kill everything with antlers, and leave the carcasses to rot because taking them home was unsporting. If a peasant child was accidentally ridden down, the family was fined for obstructing the king's pleasure with their offspring. Yet the forest kept its secrets. Outlaw bands grew in the green dark. Men who had lost eyes, hands, or hope slipped between the oaks and learned to live on what the king had forgotten to tax: air, moonlight, and the slow, certain knowledge that every tree has roots deeper than any law. Around campfires too small to betray smoke, they told a new tale. One day the king will ride too far into the green. The horns will sound, the dogs will bay, and the forest itself will close behind him like a fist. And the deer will stand unafraid, because on that day the arrows will point the other way. The nobles laughed at forest superstitions. The trees did not laugh. They simply waited. They never noticed the yeast of rebellion rising quietly in every outlawed pot. Marriage. The one thing every peasant still believed belonged to God, to love, or at least to two desperate people trying not to die alone. In the old days, it was brutally simple. A couple stood up in church, swapped promises in front of witnesses, drank too much, danced badly, and the village accepted them as husband and wife. The priest might grumble if no fee was offered, but the union was real. No lord needed to be consulted. After all, what profit was there in two poor people sharing one thin soup in a straw pallet? Then the lords realized there was profit in everything. In 1351, Thomas de Berkeley, a man whose heart was apparently 3 sizes too small and made of parchment, noticed that serf women on his Gloucestershire estates were marrying without his permission. Worse, they were marrying men from other manors where labor was scarce, which meant Thomas was losing future children who might have worked his fields. He issued the chevage known forever after as the merchant. Fee. The announcement was nailed to the church door beside the banns. No woman born upon my land may marry, whether within the manor or without, unless her body being my property until I am paid for its removal. The price, 1 fat sheep, or 12 silver pence, or, for widows daring a second husband, double. Fathers arrived at the manor house pale with rage, clutching coins scraped from under mattresses and sold wedding gifts. One man offered his only plow horse. Thomas took the horse and still demanded the sheep for late payment. The worst cases were the secret weddings. A couple would slip away at dawn, find a sympathetic priest willing to risk his living, and marry in a distant chapel. They returned home praying silence would protect them. It rarely did. A jealous neighbors, bribed reeves, or simple bad luck betrayed them.